When the calendar turned to February 13th, 1258, the soft sound of water fountains went quiet throughout the magnificent palace that had seen 36 years of Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim's rule. The sudden silence from the elaborate water features decorating the golden halls served as the first sign of approaching disaster. In a city like Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, where scholars who had traveled across vast deserts and dangerous seas gathered to access the largest collection of human knowledge ever assembled, where the very air seemed blessed with the flow of water through clever canal systems, the drying of fountains carried serious meaning. This unnatural silence became the only truth that echoed through the corridors of power. The end was coming closer with each passing moment, for just beyond the tall palace walls, the entire horizon had been filled by the presence of the Mongol army. A force unlike anything the world had witnessed before. Hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened warriors, having emerged from the harsh silence of the Central Asian steppes, now surrounded the city like an endless sea of horses and men. This was an army that understood neither the value of city civilization, nor the beauty of philosophical discussion, nor the sacredness of written knowledge. They knew only one language, and that was the brutal vocabulary of absolute conquest. Their reputation came before them like a dark shadow across the land. Now only a handful of days remained before a civilization that had stood proud and unbroken for 8 centuries would be violently removed from history's stage. Yet the true events that would send shock waves throughout the world were not merely the fall of Baghdad itself. The real horror, the acts that would haunt the collective memory of humanity, would begin only after the city gates were finally broken through. The treatment that awaited the caliph, his wife, his sons and daughters would leave a permanent stain on the records of human history. The Mongols' purpose extended far beyond simple military victory or territorial expansion. Their aim was to utterly destroy, to make an example so terrifying that the mere memory would serve as a weapon of psychological warfare for generations. The brutality was so extreme, so deliberately calculated, that even the Persian court historians who directly witnessed these events found themselves unable, or perhaps unwilling, to commit the full truth to paper. The horror was simply too overwhelming for words until this moment. Now we are digging up those dark chambers that history has attempted to seal away from view, examining the terrible truths that time tried to bury. We have the desperate letters written by Venetian merchants who barely escaped the storm, fragmentary Mongol military records that survived the centuries, and dusty Persian manuscripts written in shaking script by those who saw the unthinkable. Each surviving document reflects fragments of truth to us like pieces of a broken mirror. We are now carefully putting those pieces together, bringing forgotten horrors into the harsh light of examination. So let us travel back in time, mentally returning to Baghdad in those final days of normalcy before everything changed. The gates stand ready to be broken, and what will happen over the next 7 days will forever alter the fate of the entire Islamic world for centuries to come. To fully understand the magnitude of this destruction, you must first grasp the name standing at the center of these catastrophic events. Al-Mustasim is no ordinary political figure or regional governor. He holds the title of caliph, considered by millions to be the shadow of God upon earth, the direct successor to Prophet Muhammad himself, and the supreme leader of a vast empire that once stretched its influence from the sun-drenched shores of Spain in the west to the spice-laden coasts of India. In the east, he represents the 37th ruler in an unbroken line of the Abbasid dynasty, a succession that had lasted for 800 years without interruption, an achievement almost unmatched in human history. But like so many great dynasties before it, the Abbasid line has grown old, its strength diminished, The confidence that once drove conquest and innovation has gradually transformed into dangerous arrogance and complacency. Al-Mustasim himself represents this decline. History records him as a quilled ruler, more comfortable with palace luxuries than the harsh demands of governance. He has surrounded himself with sycophantic courtiers and advisers who tell him only what he wishes to hear, filtering out inconvenient truths about the changing world beyond his walls. While spending his days immersed in comfort and ceremony, he has convinced himself that his sacred titles and the weight of tradition will somehow protect him from all manner of danger. Even as Mongol scouts appear on the horizons and refugee reports flood in from devastated cities to the east, he clings to fatal misconceptions. Even when the Mongol horde finally stands at the very gates of his capital, he repeats the same mistakes that have marked his entire reign. In his mind, the established order of the world remains unchanged and unchangeable. He truly believes that the Mongols will recognize his authority and bow to the will of heaven. He holds not the slightest doubt that divine protection shields him from harm. No matter how savage this barbarian army might be, he cannot imagine that anyone would dare to violate his sacred position as caliph, the spiritual and temporal leader of Islam. According to his worldview, Baghdad itself is so holy, so fundamentally important to the order of creation, that its fall is simply impossible. The city represents 8 centuries of Islamic scholarship, art, science, and culture. It is the beating heart of civilization itself. How could such a place ever truly fall? But Al-Mustasim works under a catastrophic misunderstanding of the forces arranged against him. Hulagu Khan, the grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, commands the army positioned outside his walls. This is no ordinary military commander, and the force he leads is no longer merely a regular army. They have transformed into something like a natural disaster, an unstoppable force of nature that destroys everything in its path. In their devastating march across the Iranian plateau, they have systematically erased more than 40 cities from the map, leaving behind only ruins and mass graves. They have crushed armies 10 times larger than their own through superior tactics, discipline, and an absolute ruthlessness that defies understanding. In every place they have passed through, rivers have literally run red with blood. They have constructed grotesque warning towers built entirely from the severed heads of their enemies, macabre monuments designed to break the will of all who see them. Now the wealthiest, most culturally significant city in the known world lies vulnerable beneath their feet. Hulagu sends a clear and merciless message to Al-Mustasim, a communication carefully recorded for history by the Persian historian Malik Juvayni. The message is brutally simple in its terms. If you surrender immediately and open your gates, your life will be spared and you may keep some measure of dignity. If you resist, if you force us to take this city by storm, then your fate is sealed. Your city will be ground into dust, your magnificent palaces will be reduced to ashes, your family will suffer consequences beyond imagination, and your very name will be deliberately erased from the pages of history. Al-Mustasim, upon reading this ultimatum, responds only with dismissive laughter. He gathers his palace advisers and courtiers around him, his voice dripping with contempt as he declares, "These barbarians have no understanding of who they are threatening. I am the caliph, the successor to the prophet. God himself will never abandon me to such a fate. They will learn their place." But the plans of fate, or perhaps of God, prove to be entirely different from the caliph's assumptions. When the Mongol assault finally begins on January 29th, 1258, this is no conventional siege warfare. The Mongols bring to bear not only overwhelming numerical superiority, but also advanced siege technology that the defenders of Baghdad have never encountered before. Chinese engineers captured during previous conquests and forced into service have brought with them the terrible secrets of early gunpowder weapons. The siege equipment and explosive devices they deploy represent the cutting edge of military technology. The ancient walls that have protected Baghdad for centuries are subjected to relentless bombardment day and night. The thunderous impacts shake the very earth. Defensive towers that have stood for generations topple one after another like dominoes. The courage and determination of Baghdad's defenders, though admirable, proves utterly helpless against an enemy that has perfected the art of warfare and turned killing into a science. The city bleeds from thousands of wounds as its defenses crumble systematically. On February 5th, after days of continuous assault, the outer walls are finally breached. By the 10th day, organized resistance has been completely broken. And finally, on February 13th, Hulagu Khan strides triumphantly into the Abbasid throne room itself, the sacred space from which caliphs had ruled for centuries. The man who just days before believed himself untouchable by mortal hands now kneels in the dust, his ornate golden robes torn and soiled, cast down upon the floor like refuse. The divine shield he trusted in has been lifted, leaving behind only a terrified, defeated man facing his conquerors. Al-Mustasim attempts to beg for mercy, his voice cracking with desperation. Hulagu regards him with a cold, almost scientific curiosity, the way a hunter might examine prey that has fallen into a carefully prepared trap. The historian Rashid al-Din preserves that terrible moment in his chronicles. Hulagu poses a devastating question. Where is your God now? Where is the divine protection you were promised? Even as the caliph's lips move, attempting to form words, no sound emerges. Is he praying silently, or has fear paralyzed his ability to speak? No witness can say with certainty. Hulagu laughs, a sound without warmth, and adds with cruel mockery, "Since you loved gold and treasure so much, valuing it above the welfare of your people and the defense of your city, let us see if gold will sustain you." Now, at that moment, one of the most humiliating scenes in recorded history unfolds within the throne room. The Mongols bring forth the treasury, the vast wealth that the empire had accumulated over centuries. Gold coins, silver bars, precious jewels, sacred relics, all of it is piled before Al-Mustasim. Then, in an act of deliberate symbolic cruelty, they force him to consume the treasure he valued above all else. The caliph's mouth is forcibly filled with gold coins. Silver pieces are pushed between his teeth as the metal burns his throat and his teeth crack under the pressure. As his body rebels violently against this torture, his captors show no mercy. When he resists, he is beaten into submission. This torment continues for hours, deliberately prolonged. They will not permit the caliph to lose consciousness or die before the spectacle is complete. Though his stomach swells painfully and his body suffers terribly, his ordeal is far from over. This is merely the opening act. Hulagu orders that the royal family be brought before him. Al-Mustasim has 3 sons and 4 daughters. The first to be summoned is his eldest daughter, the 27-year-old Princess Fatima. This woman represents the height of Islamic scholarship and culture. She is fluent in 5 languages, has been educated in philosophy and theology, and her poetry has been translated and admired across multiple lands. She grew up believing in the transformative power of knowledge and learning. Now she is forced to her knees in front of her helpless father. The Mongol tradition prescribed specific treatment for captured nobility, but this was not an act of mercy. It was calculated humiliation designed to break not just bodies but spirits. What occurred next, the exact details of what was done to Princess Fatima, became one of those historical moments so horrific that contemporary chroniclers struggled even to hint at it in their writings. Rashid al-Din, writing years after the events, could barely force himself to record even an indirect reference. What befell her was witnessed by her father, and when it was finished, she could no longer be counted among the living. Other sources, including accounts from travelers like Marco Polo, who visited the region decades later and heard survivor testimonies, are only slightly more explicit in their descriptions. The treatment the princess suffered while her father, the most powerful man in the Islamic world, was forced to watch in absolute helplessness, represented a deliberate destruction not just of a person, but of everything she symbolized. Here was a woman of letters, a poet, a princess, a repository of learning and culture reduced to nothing by men who saw knowledge and refinement as weaknesses to be exploited and destroyed. Think for a moment about what this represents. In a single afternoon, a life devoted to intellectual pursuit and artistic expression was brutally ended by forces that valued only raw power and conquest. Her father, despite all his titles and supposed divine favor, could not raise even a hand to prevent what occurred before his eyes. But the night's horrors are not yet concluded. After Princess Fatima's fate is sealed, Hulagu summons the caliph's sons. Though Al-Mustasim knows full well what the next caliph should be, one of these young men, he is powerless to halt what follows. The three princes are brought forward, 23-year-old Prince Mubarak, 21-year-old Prince Ahmed, and 14-year-old Prince Ali. They are young men, some still barely more than boys, who cannot fully understand that they are witnessing the final curtain falling on their family's 8th-century rule. Hulagu observes them with the detached gaze of a craftsman examining his materials, and he repeats the question he posed to their father. Where is your God now? Where is the divine protection promised to the house of Abbas? A brief hesitation falls over the scene. The world has been turned upside down so rapidly that this moment seems somehow unreal, as if they are all actors in a nightmare from which they might still awaken. Yesterday, these young men were heirs to an empire spanning continents. Today, they stand before their executioner in chains. Prince Mubarak, perhaps drawing on the last reserves of family pride, perhaps clinging to the final shreds of faith that have sustained his lineage for generations, steps forward and speaks, "God will punish you for these crimes. Justice may be delayed, but it will come." Hulagu nods slowly, almost appreciatively, as if acknowledging a student who has recited a lesson correctly. Then he quietly gives his orders to the guards. According to ancient Mongol beliefs, the spilling of noble blood directly upon the ground brings misfortune and curses upon the land. Therefore, they have developed methods of execution that avoid this supernatural danger. Methods that are no less fatal, but leave no blood visible to stain the earth. Large carpets are brought into the throne room. One by one, each prince is wrapped tightly within these carpets, bound so thoroughly that movement becomes impossible. Then, systematically and methodically, they are beaten to death through the layers of fabric. The carpets muffle their cries. No blood is spilled where it can be seen. By the time the carpets are finally unrolled, 3 young men who represented the future of a dynasty have been silenced forever. Al-Mustasim is forced to witness the systematic execution of his sons, watching the life leave each one as they are beaten within their fabric prisons. He has now seen his daughter destroyed and his sons killed. But the Mongols have no intention of granting him a quick death. Hulagu desires the final curtain to be appropriately ceremonial, a symbolic ending to match the symbolic importance of what is being destroyed. He orders that the caliph be wrapped tightly in carpets just as his sons were, bound securely in the dark, airless confinement of heavy fabric. But Al-Mustasim's end is designed differently. A sturdy wooden platform is constructed and placed over the carpet, bound caliph. Then Hulagu and his generals arrange a victory feast upon this platform. As the man trapped below slowly suffocates, unable to move, unable to call out, the Mongol commanders eat roasted meat and drink wine at the table above him. They laugh and celebrate their conquest. Every movement of the celebrating warriors, every shift of weight presses the carpet down a little more firmly. Every laugh and shout serves as a reminder that life and victory belong to them. While beneath their feet the last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad draws his final labored breaths, the feast continues through the night until the first light of dawn. When the last cups have been emptied and the celebration finally ends, the carpet is unrolled. The caliph's face is bruised and discolored, his eyes fixed open in a frozen expression of horror and suffocation. There is no blood, no visible wound, only the unmistakable marks of asphyxiation. Thus ends the 800-year reign of the Abbasid dynasty in Baghdad, concluded within the span of a single terrible week. But the terror is not confined to the palace walls. Baghdad itself now lies utterly defenseless. Its gates thrown open, its military forces destroyed or scattered. The Mongol army spreads through the city's neighborhoods like wildfire, consuming dry timber. The massacre that follows continues without pause for days. No distinctions are made between scholars and merchants, between women and children, between imams praying in mosques and beggars huddled in alleyways. Entire neighborhoods are systematically cleared in a matter of hours. The streets become so choked with the bodies of the fallen that horses cannot pass through. According to the most reliable contemporary estimates, nearly 1 million people, perhaps more, are killed in the sacking of Baghdad. The city that once hosted the brightest minds in the world is transformed into an endless cemetery. But perhaps the greatest tragedy, the loss that would echo through centuries, befalls that legendary repository of learning, the House of Wisdom, and the numerous libraries scattered throughout Baghdad. Nowhere else in the medieval world could be found such an unmatched collection of manuscripts, scientific treatises, philosophical works, and literary achievements. The accumulated knowledge of civilizations, Greek, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Islamic, had been gathered, translated, preserved, and expanded upon here for centuries. Now, in a matter of days, this irreplaceable heritage is deliberately destroyed. Some texts are burned in massive bonfires that rage for days. Others are thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that, according to multiple contemporary accounts, the river itself changes color, first turning black from the ink of countless books, then running red as the massacre continues. A scholar named Ibn Wadi manages to survive by hiding in a well, remaining there for 3 days without food or water, listening to the screams and destruction above. When he finally emerges, too weak to stand properly, the sight that greets him is almost beyond comprehension. In his own written account, preserved in fragments, he describes it thus: "I remained hidden for 3 days in darkness. When I finally came forth, I found that the city I had known had ceased to exist. The streets were carpeted with the dead. The smell of death hung so thick in the air that breathing itself became difficult. Packs of wild dogs moved freely, feeding on the corpses. As I walked through what had been my home, the only sounds were the buzzing of countless flies and distant cries of survivors and the dying. Imagine walking through your own city and finding it transformed into a landscape of death. Imagine that a civilization has lost not only its people, but its very memory, its art, its dreams, its books, its accumulated wisdom of centuries, all erased in days of wanton destruction. The Mongol Empire would go on to rule vast territories for another century and a half, conquering lands from Korea to Hungary. They would establish sophisticated administrations and even patronize arts and learning in later generations. But the one thing they could never truly conquer was memory itself. Though Baghdad fell, though its people were scattered or killed, the story of what happened to the caliph's family would not be forgotten. Those who survived, and there were some who did, passed this narrative down through generations in whispers and written fragments. Over centuries, these whispers have reached across time to us. The reason we must tell these stories now, difficult as they are to hear, is not to reopen old wounds or to foster hatred. Rather, it is because some truths are so terrible that they cannot be allowed to fade into comfortable forgetfulness. Because if we forget, if we allow these lessons to disappear from collective memory, history has a disturbing tendency to repeat its darkest chapters. When historians discuss the fall of Baghdad, they often speak in abstract numbers. 1 million dead, a burned library, a destroyed city, but numbers do not suffer. Numbers do not beg for mercy. Numbers do not know what it means to be alive, to hope, to fear, to love. That is why we must pause and try to truly comprehend what happened during those 7 days. The end of a civilization is not a single moment of collapse. It is a chain of irreparable breakdowns, each one making the next more inevitable. After the caliph dies beneath that platform, after the symbolic heart of the Islamic world has been literally crushed, the killing becomes easier, more routine. With no deputy of God remaining, with no sacred authority to serve as a final barrier, the city becomes simply another conquered territory to be pacified. The Mongols move methodically, house by house, street by street, through Baghdad's neighborhoods. Those who hide are dragged out. Those who attempt to flee are hunted down. Those who seek sanctuary in mosques are killed while in prayer, their blood staining the floors where they had come seeking divine protection. Survivors who live to tell their stories report that the streets literally ran with so much blood that the ground turned to mud. By the 3rd day, the entire city began to smell of decomposing flesh in the heat. Not only common people, but particularly the bearers of knowledge become targets. Doctors, astronomers, mathematicians, philosophers. These are not seen as neutral civilians by the Mongols, but as potential threats. Because knowledge represents power, and the Mongol purpose is not merely to rule this city, but to break it so completely that resistance becomes unthinkable. The house of wisdom burns for days, the flames visible for miles around. The collections built over centuries, priceless Greek texts translated into Arabic, Persian poetry, Indian mathematical treatises, original Islamic theological works, all are destroyed by men who neither read nor write. The Tigris River becomes so clogged with books and manuscripts that, according to legend, a Mongol warrior is able to cross the river on horseback without his mount getting wet, walking across a bridge formed entirely of floating books. One Mongol soldier, seeing ink-stained water on his horse's legs, after such a crossing reportedly jokes, "Look, even the water is trying to become educated." This merciless joke captures how the conquerors view themselves as a force beyond and above human civilization. By the end of the 7th day, Baghdad is no longer a living city. The walls still stand, but life has been extinguished. The bustling markets are silent. The sophisticated canal system is filled with corpses. For the first time in centuries, the capital of the Islamic world falls completely silent. There is no call to prayer echoing from the minarets. There is no sound of book pages turning in libraries. There are no debates in the courtyards, no poetry recited in the gardens. The lesson that history presents to us through this great tragedy is stark and unavoidable. The Mongols do not stay to rebuild. They do not establish permanent administration in Baghdad or attempt to restore its functions. They burn, destroy, deliver their message of absolute power, and then continue their westward march. The Mongol war machine requires constant forward momentum. Baghdad becomes a warning marker on the map, a bloody example designed to terrorize all who hear of its fate. This terror tactic proves devastatingly effective. Other rulers throughout the Middle East, hearing in detail what befell Baghdad and its caliph, surrender without resistance. They open their gates, offer tribute, anything to avoid sharing Baghdad's fate. The city has paid the price for an entire region's survival. However, even as the Mongol armies continue westward towards Syria and Egypt, the story spreads faster than they can march. The world talks in hushed tones about that scene in the palace, the caliph crushed beneath the platform, the destruction of the royal family, the systematic elimination of a dynasty. These details circulate like a curse that follows the conquerors. Because if such things can happen to Baghdad, the greatest city in the Islamic world, then nowhere is truly safe. This realization fundamentally changes the course of Middle Eastern history. The Golden Age of Islam does not end in a single catastrophic night, but its axis shifts dramatically and permanently. The center of Islamic learning and power moves to other cities, Cairo, Damascus, Samarkand. The world continues turning, but now it bears a deep visible scar. You can see evidence of this historical trauma in the subsequent behavior of Islamic states. City walls become thicker and more formidable. Libraries begin to be hidden or fortified like military installations. The openness and confidence that characterized the earlier Islamic Golden Age gives way to a more defensive, cautious posture. Those who escape from Baghdad scatter across the known world, carrying their traumatic memories with them. In Aleppo, Cairo, and distant villages, survivors tell their stories. Perhaps they do not share the most graphic details with younger listeners, but they transmit enough to ensure the memory remains alive. The Mongols could destroy buildings and burn books, but they could not erase human memory and oral tradition. Over time, even the mighty Mongol Empire begins to fragment. The great Khans turn against one another in succession struggles. The unified empire splits into competing khanates. Eventually, they are conquered in turn or absorbed into other cultures. But Baghdad remains a powerful symbol across the Islamic world and beyond. It stands as evidence that even the mightiest civilizations, when they close their eyes to emerging dangers and trust in past glories rather than present realities, can collapse with shocking speed. Al-Mustasim believed his titles would grant him immortality and protection. He trusted in divine favor while neglecting practical defense. His faith in the unchanging order of things proved to be a fatal blindness. If there is a lesson this story teaches us, it is this: no civilization, regardless of how wealthy, how knowledgeable, how culturally sophisticated, is immune to destruction. Power and glory are not permanent states, but temporary conditions that must be actively maintained. The moment we begin to believe in our own invincibility is precisely the moment we become most vulnerable. Now, I want you to pause and reflect for a moment on what you have heard. Remember those silent fountains. How the first warning sign was not a dramatic alarm, but a subtle absence of sound. Disasters always begin this way, on days that seem ordinary, right up until the moment when everything you believed to be permanent and secure is suddenly gone. You have witnessed one of the darkest weeks in human history. If this story has reminded you of how capable humans are of terrible cruelty, but also how fragile even the greatest achievements of civilization can be, then do not allow this truth to be buried in silence once again. Do not permit these lessons to fade from memory. Subscribe to Vox History and help us keep these difficult but important pages of history alive and accessible. Because when we forget the past, when we allow these stories to disappear, history does not remain safely contained in the past. It emerges from its hiding places and finds ways to repeat itself in new forms. The fall of Baghdad stands as an eternal warning. Vigilance, wisdom, and the courage to face hard truths are the only true defenses against the darkness that humans are capable of creating.